Hello, everybody, and welcome to Charts with Dan. We have an unexpected number one movie at the box office this weekend. We're going to talk about Space Jam: A New Legacy, Black Widow. We're going to go into those numbers. We're going to try to put things into a little bit of context as well, because there are some things that people have been talking a lot about, some things that people haven't been talking too much about when it comes to the box office this weekend. So let's jump right into it because there's a lot to get to. And looking at the box office top five, this was a surprising result. Almost nobody, myself included, figured that Space Jam: A New Legacy would surpass Black Widow in its second week at the box office, but it did at $31 million. It wasn't even particularly close. Black Widow in its second week at $25.8 million. So let's focus on these two movies first of all. And the surprising result at the box office is really the result of two things. The first thing is an overperformance on the part of Space Jam. When people were looking at the box office this weekend leading up to it and kind of trying to figure out what things were going to do, they thought Space Jam was going to do about $20 million. It ended up doing over $10 million above that. So that's the first thing. That's one of the real reasons that it's a surprise, is nobody really saw this kind of enthusiasm with Space Jam, especially because it was available day and date on HBO Max. But that's something that we've seen over and over again, is that we talk about the streaming numbers and how they may have affected Black Widow last week. It seems with a lot of these Warner Brothers releases that the day and date streaming doesn't affect those movies as much as it might have, or maybe as much as would be expected. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the other reason this is such a surprise is that Black Widow had a drop-off that is somewhat surprising for an MCU film. And when we look at the MCU, Black Widow actually had the biggest weekend 1 to weekend 2 drop-off in the history of the franchise. We're looking here. This is an order of drop-off from the first to the second weekend. This is domestically by percentage. Black Panther, you'll see, had the best hold from its first weekend to its second weekend. It dropped off at 45%, followed by Thor and Doctor Strange. Those are the only Marvel movies that have had a less than 50% drop off. But then you see in the middle there, the vast majority of Marvel films have dropped off between 50 and 59%. There are only 5 movies that have had a drop of 60% or higher between their first and second weekends. The Incredible Hulk at 60%, Captain America the First Avenger at 61%, Spider-Man Homecoming and Ant-Man and the Wasp both at 62%. And then with Black Widow, once the final numbers came in, it was reported yesterday with the estimates that Black Widow had dropped 67%. When the final numbers came in, it actually dropped 68%. So you can see that is the biggest drop weekend to weekend of any movie in the MCU. And so a lot of people have said, well, I mean, this just proves that there's something going on. I mean, there is obviously something going on. We know that there's something going on. There's a lot of things going on. And this is where, and I fell into this trap a little bit a couple weeks ago when I was looking at F9's numbers, because I got so excited and I got ahead of myself and I wanted to get back to analyzing the box office as if this were normal times. These aren't normal times. That's number one. So I'm not necessarily sticking up for Black Widow here, because I'm gonna talk about the reasons why this drop may have happened. But I will say first of all that if you're looking at an apples to apples comparisons, we are in very unprecedented times when it comes to box office performance and analyzing box office performance. And yes, that's very frustrating. It's frustrating to me too. I wish we could just get back to the way that things were, but that's not where we are. We're not where things were, and we're not going to be where things were for quite some time. So that's the first contributor when we're looking at this drop, is that we are still in very unique circumstances. That doesn't mean we should discount a 68% drop. That's still pretty big, but it is something to weigh in. However, looking kind of at the other side of the coin, when people say, well, streaming is the reason that it dropped off 68%, the numbers on other movies that came out day and date on streaming don't necessarily bear that out. These are all movies that opened number one and were also available day and date in some form on streaming this year in 2021. Let's look at their drop-off. Raya and the Last Dragon actually had the lowest drop-off. It's funny because when Raya and the Last Dragon opened, it was a fairly low number, lower than we were expecting, and people kind of blame streaming. However, it had the lowest drop-off weekend to weekend of any movie, and it's actually had fairly good legs at the box office. Tom and Jerry at 53%, The Little Things at 56%, Godzilla vs. Kong and The Conjuring both 57%. These were HBO releases that were available on HBO Max day and date. They had drop-offs that you would expect kind of for a standard movie. You know, between 50 and 60% is average for a movie, particularly one that opens at number one. Then you have Black Widow at 68%, but the biggest drop-off week to week for a number one movie that was available on streaming was Mortal Kombat. That dropped 73%. But also keep in mind, these movies opened substantially lower than Black Widow did. Black Widow had the biggest opening of the pandemic so far. So that's another factor to keep in mind. Number one, we are not in normal times. Number two, Black Widow had further to fall than any other movie since the pandemic started with its $80 million opening. So this drop-off may look a little worse out of context because it opened bigger than any of these other films. We talked about that big drop from Friday to Saturday last week when Black Widow opened, that it may have been indicative of a huge surge of enthusiasm on the first day, dropped off by Saturday and Sunday. This is what we're seeing exemplified again through weekend two, which is that Marvel was able to turn out the diehard fans on the opening day of the movie. It's just that it seems they've lost a lot of the other folks that might have gone to the movie in its first weekend on Saturday and Sunday and on its second weekend to different things. So then the question becomes, where are these people going? Why aren't these people, so many showed up on day one, but where were the people on Saturday and Sunday last weekend? Where were the people this weekend to keep Black Widow from dropping off as much as it did? I think there's a few answers to that. Number one, the pandemic, lingering effects of the pandemic here. We have new concerns about the Delta variant. Masking mandates went back up in Los Angeles County. I think people that may have gone, that were maybe coming out of this period of hesitancy, maybe are not so inclined to go to the theaters. These may even have been people that went to see Black Widow last weekend. A lot can change in a week. So I think there's lingering effects and concerns in the pandemic. Number two, repeat viewers. There may be people normally, when a normal Marvel movie is out, they would go see it again the second weekend. Maybe they went to see it that first weekend and then did not make that return trip again, maybe because of pandemic concerns, maybe because they just felt that one time was enough. Another factor, of course, is Disney Plus. Now, perhaps it's a little telling we did not get Disney Plus numbers this weekend. Last weekend, Disney Plus released the numbers. I said on last week's show, in my personal opinion, they released those numbers to keep the narrative from Black Widow being that it was a flop or that it was not a commercial success, because the box office numbers looked a little bit better. $80 million isn't bad, but in context with everything else, it looked a little bit better when they threw in that $60 million streaming number on Disney Plus. Piracy is another concern. I mean, let's be honest here. Unlike every other Marvel film, there was a pristine copy of this movie available within hours of its release. I don't think that pirates make up a majority of the people that didn't go see Black Widow, that may have anyway, but I think that there's probably a larger number than usual because you have high quality versions of these films out there. However, as I just showed with the HBO Max thing, if piracy was the driving concern behind all of this, then we would have seen, I think, much steeper drop-offs between these movies. The ones that are on HBO Max were also available for piracy immediately. They didn't have as far to fall, but I still think percentage-wise, if piracy was the main driving factor, then we would see drop-offs like this. The National Association of Theater Owners, NATO, put out a statement after this weekend, basically, railing against Disney for doing Disney Plus and saying, you cost yourself ancillary benefits and the movie would have opened so much higher. They brought in piracy. And of course, that's what the National Association of Theater Owners is going to do. Of course, they're going to blast Disney for putting their movie out on streaming, because this is money that they are not making. Theater owners are the real losers here. If you're going to talk winners and losers, Disney, we'll see how they do. First of all, we don't know when or if Black Widow is going to come out in China. I think that piracy is going to have a huge impact on that release, along with what seems to be some mixed word of mouth. But Disney is probably going to find a way to make some money on this movie eventually. The theater owners are objectively the losers here when you look at this setup, because for whatever reason, people aren't going to the theaters, they lose. If it's because of the pandemic, then they lose. If it's because Disney put it out on Premiere Plus, or it's because of piracy, they lose. Theater owners are the big losers here. And so, of course, they're going to stand up for themselves. But I think that everybody is trying to pin these numbers on one thing. And I don't think that one thing is to blame. I think that this drop is the combination of a lot of different things. Number one, just the unique times that we are in. Number two, Disney Plus is obviously taking a bite out of it. Number three, there is a piracy factor involved, I'm sure. And then number four, I think you kind of have to look at the movie itself. Black Widow does not have the must-see feel of some other Marvel movies. We are not in the realm of an Avengers Endgame. We are not in the realm of a Black Panther or a Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't think that word of mouth on the movie is bad, but I think that for people that are perhaps a little hesitant to go to the theater, I don't think it's so overwhelmingly good that they're saying, oh, well, I've got to rush out and maybe take the chance. So there's a lot of different factors here with this Black Widow thing, and I know that that's not the sexy take. The sexy take is not to say, well, let's look at a number of mitigating factors, but I think that's honestly the truth. And I would love more than anything for things to go back to the way they were, but I don't think that's ever going to happen, number one. I think that the movie distribution model has been changed forever, but especially right now. We're not even close to finding a new normal at the box office or knowing what a new normal means. We'll see what happens with Black Widow going forward. There were some encouraging signs for the box office, particularly in the specialty box office, which we'll look at. But even though movies are coming out, it's still tough if you're a theater owner, and you've got to be hoping that some of these factors, the pandemic, the streaming aspect from Disney Plus, etc., are going to go away very soon and start bringing more people through the doors. There is one thing I wanted to mention that's getting lost in the shuffle of all of this, which is that, people are really lauding Space Jam: A New Legacy for this surprising victory. I did want to bring up one thing, which is that Space Jam: A New Legacy has a budget of $150 million, and it opened to just over $30 million. If these were normal times, a $30 million opening for a $150 million movie would be seen as disastrous. We would be talking about how big of a flop Space Jam: A New Legacy was. That's equivalent budget-wise to the first Wonder Woman movie. Imagine if Wonder Woman had come out in 2017 and made $30 million. We would all be losing our minds because that would be a hugely disappointing figure. However, I do think that a sliding scale is being applied to Space Jam: A New Legacy, probably because it had this big victory. And I don't think that Black Widow is getting the kind of slack cut to it that Space Jam: A New Legacy is. And that's the other thing that I want to point out is when we're looking at these times and when we're looking at winners and losers, you have to adjust the market fairly for all movies, because you can't take Black Widow to task right now for its huge drop in week 2 and yet congratulate Space Jam: A New Legacy for making $30 million when, again, in normal times, that would have been a very bad figure. You have to apply the same things to Space Jam and say a lot of that money might have been taken away from streaming. A lot of that money may have been taken away from piracy. I don't see a lot of people talking about the low number for Space Jam when, in fact, for a $150 million budgeted movie, that is pretty low. Black Widow had a $200 million budget, which is $50 million more than Space Jam: A New Legacy, and yet it opened twice as big at $80 million. So that's something else to keep in mind. Context. Keep context in mind and make sure that if we're talking about the impacts of the time for one movie, we're also talking about the impacts of the time for another movie. Let's take a look at the rest of the top 5. Escape Room Tournament of Champions was in second place, getting close there to $9 million. That was less than half of what the original movie took in. I was looking, the cinema score was at a B for that movie. So we'll see how that legs out, if it can replicate in any way the surprise success of the original. I would imagine when that is available on streaming, and it's probably going to be an abbreviated window, that'll be a much more popular thing for people to watch at home, maybe premium video on demand. So they may be looking at another revenue stream for this movie, but will it spawn a third? The budgets are kept pretty low on these movies. This one was not an expensive one to make, so it's a pretty good chance that it's going to make money. Maybe they're going to keep this franchise going. F9 in its fourth week is in fourth place at $7.6 million, and The Boss Baby Family Business in its third week with its disturbing poster is in fifth place with $4.7 million. Now, we've been doing this kind of fun exercise this summer where we're looking at the combined gross of the top 5 domestic box office movies and comparing it to summers past. And what we've been seeing is that this summer is essentially replicating the pattern of past summers, just at a smaller scale. So let's look with the week 11 numbers added in, and we're still seeing this pattern continue. We're seeing the movies kind of going up and down around the debuts of these blockbusters. It's just that we have, to a smaller degree, the number of people that are actually going to the movies this summer. So this is continuing to back up our theory that this summer is proceeding pretty much as a standard one. It's just that we have far fewer people that are actually going to the movies. Audience interest is spiking at around the same time. It's just the degree of attendance. It's very interesting to see the fact that, we're having a standard summer. It's just not as big as it usually is. Looking at the top per theater this past weekend, Space Jam: A New Legacy is number one. It brought in $7,800, a little over $7,800 per theater in 3,965 theaters. That's a little less than half of what Black Widow brought in last week. Still a lot of business coming into theaters, but they were not seeing the kind of action that they saw last weekend. Although, anecdotally, I went to the theater this past weekend to see one of the movies that's on our next chart, and there were quite a few people there. Let's look at the top 5 in limited release. So these are movies that are playing opening in less than 1,000 theaters. And Roadrunner, a documentary film about Anthony Bourdain, is number one. And this is the biggest specialty box office / limited release number we've seen in a while, almost $2 million. A little bit of controversy erupted around this film this past week. The director of the film, Morgan Neville, was taken to task by some people for feeding Anthony Bourdain's voice into an AI and then having that AI generate him reading words that he wrote but never actually spoke. And some people just sort of objecting to that from a documentarian standpoint, the fact that they believe it's a distortion. This is a movie that a lot of people are saying could have Oscar hopes in the documentary category. If this controversy continues, that could stand in its way if this continues to gain traction. The second movie at the limited release box office is one that I saw this weekend, Nicolas Cage in Pig, in 552 theaters. It made almost $1 million, which is a really good showing for that film. I'm going to try to get a review of this movie up this weekend because I really enjoyed this film. Nicolas Cage was great in the movie, and I'd like to talk about it more, so stay tuned for that. Summer of Soul, which has been the number one movie the last few weeks, is still at number 3 with $180,000 in its third week. Impressive, particularly because it's also available on Hulu streaming. A lot of people choosing to go see that in a theater. 12 Mighty Orphans in 140 theaters in its sixth week with $88,000, and then Queen Bee still hanging around in its sixth week at $49,000. So taking ourselves out of the domestic box office, let's look around the world, and let's first look at the international box office. So this is the box office around the world if you take the domestic marketplace out, which is the US and Canada. Canada had a lot of theaters opening this past weekend, and the number one movie internationally is Chinese Doctors. We talked about this last week. This is part of China's big push to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party in China. There are many very pro-Chinese films that are opening, and this is a celebration of the frontline doctors during the COVID-19 pandemic, the beginning of it last year. So that is the number one movie internationally just due to its strength in China. Black Widow is second with $29.9 million. F9 is third with $28.6. Space Jam: A New Legacy is fourth with just over $23 million. And then another Chinese film, a musical called The Day We Lit Up the Sky, is at number 5 with $11.7 million. Keep in mind, July traditionally in China, even in years where they're not celebrating this big milestone in the history of the Communist Party, is generally a month where they focus on domestic films. So that's why we have, number one, not seen a release date on Black Widow, and there's a lot of speculation about that. With the piracy concerns here, is piracy also going to be a concern in China? Will the word of mouth travel in advance of the film, and will we see a disappointing result for Disney in China? We don't know that because we don't even know when Black Widow is coming out there yet. Now let's look at the worldwide box office. So this is combining the domestic box office with the international box office, and the number one film in the world is Black Widow with $55.7 million. It's able to maintain that lead over Space Jam: A New Legacy. Space Jam: A New Legacy is at number 2 with $54 million. Then Chinese Doctors, just based off of its number domestically in China, is at number 3. F9 at number 4 with $36.3 million. And then driven largely by the domestic box office, Escape Room: Tournament of Champions at $12.2 million. Something to keep in mind with Space Jam: A New Legacy, like Black Widow, it also does not have a Chinese release date, but the NBA, very popular in China, so we could see a big surge in international box office from Space Jam: A New Legacy when it opens in China, but again, we just don't have those dates yet. Looking at the top 10 summer movies, we have a very close race. I talked last week about F9 and if it was going to make it to be the number one movie of the summer. It is less than $100,000 away from being the number one movie of the summer. It's going to get there. I did not anticipate that Black Widow would take such a dive in its second weekend, and I thought that it may overtake F9 before it made it to number one, but F9 is going to spend some time. Probably right now, it is the number one movie of the summer. We'll see how Black Widow does in week 3, if it can overtake F9 by the time we do charts next week. But for at least part of this week, F9 is going to be the number one movie of the summer. Right now, it's at number 2. Black Widow moves up one spot to 3, bumping Cruella down to 4. The Conjuring stays at number 5. The Boss Baby Family Business jumps up 2 spots to number 6. Peter Rabbit 2, The Runaway, and The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard both drop down 1 spot. The Forever Purge moves up 1 spot to 9. Space Jam: A New Legacy opens at number 10 on the chart. That'll be moving up very quickly. And the first casualty of my summer list, In the Heights, drops off of the top 10 chart. So when we look at my summer predictions, I have my first title in red. I picked In the Heights as the 5th highest grossing movie of the summer.
Not a good pick. Obviously not. I was very high on the movie. Audiences were not, and Space Jam actually outgrossed In the Heights in its first weekend. So it goes to show you what I know, because I didn't even put Space Jam on this list, nor did I put Cruella on this list. I think it's looking increasingly likely that one or both of them are going to be on the final list. Black Widow is currently ranked number 3. I have it at number 1. F9 is currently ranked number 2. I have it at number 4. A Quiet Place Part 2 and The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It are still on the list. Still to open from my picks, The Suicide Squad, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, Free Guy, Jungle Cruise, and Candyman. We'll see how those do. But I'm looking at going 8 out of 10, maybe worse, depending on how some of these movies do. So not going to be a great batting average for me this summer. But to be fair, as I mentioned, this is unlike any summer that we've ever had before. Let's look at the 2021 domestic box office, and not a whole lot has changed from last week. Black Widow moves up 2 spots to number 3. That bumps Godzilla vs. Kong and Cruella down 2 spots. And then 6 through 10, everything's pretty much the same, except that the Boss Baby Family Business joins the chart at number 10. That drops Mortal Kombat out of the top 10. And then looking at the 2021 worldwide box office, the biggest jump coming from Black Widow, it jumps up to number 5 worldwide, displacing A Quiet Place Part 2. It has a lot of ground to cover to get up to that number 4 spot, but we'll see how it does. A Quiet Place Part 2, Cruella, Cliff Walkers, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and A Writer's Odyssey all drop down 1 spot. And we'll see how Chinese Doctors, Space Jam, etc., how they continue to advance if we're going to see them on this chart eventually. Before we look at what people are watching at home, let's take a flashback to a past weekend in box office history. Now, this is a big weekend for a number of reasons, mainly because several Christopher Nolan films have come out on this weekend. This is kind of his select box office weekend, so we're talking Dark Knight Rises, Dark Knight, Inception, etc. But there was an even bigger milestone that I wanted to highlight, and for this you have to go all the way back to 1987 when one of my favorite movies of all time opened. July 17th through 19th, 1987, the number 1 film at the box office was RoboCop. That was a summer release. I love this movie, and one thing that I really never realized is that RoboCop opened the same week as Jaws the Revenge. Jaws, of course, is my favorite movie. Jaws the Revenge is not my favorite movie. A 50th anniversary re-release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was actually the second highest grossing box office movie of that weekend. Revenge of the Nerds 2, Nerds in Paradise, was bumped down to number 4 in its second week, and then Stanley Kubrick, Full Metal Jacket at number 4. What a weird mix of movies. A Disney animated classic, 2 not so great sequels, and then 2 really solid films from 2 very different filmmakers. You could really get just about anything you wanted if you went to the box office in July of 1987. As we always do, let's wrap up the show by seeing what people are watching at home, and we'll start with the Amazon charts. Keep in mind, this is purchases and rentals only. This is not movies like The Tomorrow War, which are just available for streaming. Wrath of Man opened its rental window, and so it is number 1 on the chart. It was on the chart as a buy last week. It enters as a rent this week. A Quiet Place Part 2 also opening as a purchase option. It's at number 2. The Rental of Nobody is at number 3. Wrath of Man 4K rentals at number 4, so it takes up 2 spots on the top 10. Those Who Wish to Be Dead Premium Video on Demand is at number 5. A Quiet Place is at number 6. Spiral from the Book of Saw, the rental window is open on that. It's at number 7. Escape Room at number 8. Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, I guess some people wanting to revisit Jurassic World 2 at number 9, and Mamma Mia at number 10. Looking at what people are watching on iTunes, at number 1 is Wrath of Man. This is a very popular film. The buy-rent window is open on that, so it's at number 1. A lot of people buying A Quiet Place Part 2, the purchase option for that, number 2 on the iTunes charts. Nobody at number 3. City of Lies, which we've seen on this chart before, was available as a 99-cent rental, so I think that probably explains why it's there at number 4. Godzilla vs. Kong at number 5. A Quiet Place 2 movie collection, so this is the purchase option for the first 2 films, is at number 6. Till Death, The Courier, and Werewolves Within are all holdovers at number 7, 8, and 9. And then Space Jam, the original film. I guess people, before they head to the theaters, they wanted to catch up on the original because, you really can't understand Space Jam: A New Legacy unless you've seen the first one. The stories are very intricately connected. So a lot of people watching the first Michael Jordan Space Jam at number 10. And wrapping it up with what people are watching on Netflix, this is a very interesting weekend. Let's look at Netflix overall. At number 1 is the Netflix original series Virgin River, a holdover from last week. A new season of Never Have I Ever, another Netflix original, is at number 2. Gunpowder Milkshake, this movie's gotten a lot of buzz. I haven't watched it yet, but I've heard a lot of buzz around it. Netflix original movie at number 3. Fear Street 1666, the third and final of the Fear Street trilogy that have been coming out in consecutive weeks, is at number 4. A Netflix original series Heist is at 5. And then Twilight is at 6. Twilight New Moon is at 8. Manifest, the now canceled NBC series, is at 7. The original Netflix series Sex Life at 9. And because this could never not be, Coco Melon is at number 10. Coco Melon, apparently, not even Twilight can knock Coco Melon off of the top 10 list. But then when we look at just the movies that people are watching on Netflix, this was a Twilight weekend on Netflix. Gunpowder Milkshake and Fear Street 1666 were number 1 and 2. But look at this. Number 3, Twilight. Number 4, Twilight New Moon. Number 5, Twilight Eclipse. Number 6, Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2, which strangely is more popular than Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1. I guess people just skipped the first part and went straight to the second part. Number 10 is a movie called Cosmic Sin, which came out straight to streaming earlier this year. But the only holdovers on the movie chart are the 2 Fear Street movies at number 7 and 9, of Twilight dominating the Netflix movie chart. They just opened up for streaming on Netflix this weekend, so a lot of people, I guess, reliving the Twilight saga or perhaps introducing it to people for the first time. Whatever floats your boat. Why not? And that's all I've got for this week on Charts with Dan. Coming up this weekend, we have 2 major releases hitting theaters. M. Night Shyamalan's Old, which I just have a feeling about. I have a feeling that M. Night might be returning to form, and maybe not in a good way, but I'm definitely going to be checking that out, and I'm going to bring you my review here this week. Also, Snake Eyes, G.I. Joe Origins will be hitting theaters, and I'm kind of curious to see how this one does. Both of these movies are going to be theatrical exclusives, meaning you will not be able to stream these movies day and date anywhere else, so it'll be interesting to see if there's any box office appeal to that. I think Snake Eyes could maybe surprise some people. I don't know. It's hard to get a feel on the buzz, but I don't know. I have a feeling about that movie as well. I'm hoping to bring you reviews of both of those this weekend. Check that out. Also, don't forget to check out Pig. I'm going to have a review of that up later this week. And if you want to see even more of what I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. We just did our watch along for this month. We also have Dan's Movie Club coming up, a bunch of Schmodown stuff. I'm really excited to share everything with my patrons every month. So if you want to come hang out, we'd love to have you be part of the community. But first and foremost, thank you for watching this episode of Charts with Dan. I will be back next week with a full breakdown of the box office. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time. Bye.